Mi sono reso conto che io sono l'unica persona a parlare in inglese. Allora ho deciso che la prossima volta che Maurizio compie 70 anni parlerò in italiano, ma non questa volta, infatti. E per restare con il tema delle tracce, infatti ho registrato tutto in anticipo e lo ripeterò qua e forse lo modificherò un po' nel processo, insomma, di leggerlo. Comunque, here we go. My interest in Maurizio Ferraris' work has been fundamentally driven by two interrelated features that, in my view, continue to define and sustain the force and significance of his thought. First, his work presents a commitment to a positive realism that rejects the excesses of constructivism and negative critique by recognizing the distinction between ontology and epistemology, as well as the difference between natural, ideal, and social objects. It is worth emphasizing that this realist turn was first developed by Ferraris in the early 90s, long before the more recent emergence of continental realist positions, such as those of speculative realism and new materialism. Second, Ferraris' pre-2024 work grounds the genesis and persistence of social reality, as opposed to natural objects, on the constitutive, irreducible, and impersonal force of recording. These two features are interrelated. The rejection of the transcendental fallacy, i.e. the insistence on the distinction between ontology and epistemology, provides the critical basis for Ferraris' realism, which would in turn require rethinking the social domain beyond constructivism. As a result, the turn towards realism and the development of a documental social ontology appear to be two continuous moments of a single new realist project that has become synonymous with the name Maurizio Ferraris. The originality and force of Ferraris' social ontology stands out especially when one compares it to John Searle, whose work has been especially influential in the field. Stated as concisely as possible, Searle aims to naturalize social reality through a building block approach that moves from individual and collective intentionality to status function declarations and the constitutive rules that are said to give rise to institutional facts. On this view, social objects exist because they are collectively recognized as such through the basic formula X counts as Y in C. Ferraris' rebuttal is transformative. He accepts that Searle's position amounts to a weak form of realism in which social objects are constructed on the basis of physical objects. Nevertheless, he persuasively rejects the primacy accorded to intentionality by arguing that social objects are constructed from physical objects, or, more precisely, from recording broadly construed. Intentionality itself ultimately presupposes this prior layer of recording, such that documentality constitutes the condition of possibility for both individual and collective intentionality, as well as social reality more generally. This statement has far-reaching consequences, since it situates the social at the level of durable traces that precede and exceed any individual or collective beliefs. The move from collective intentionality to documentality acts as a corrective to at least four limitations inherent in Searle's framework, as well as other building block approaches to social ontology. First, recordings are said to institute and maintain social reality, thereby accounting for its endurance in the absence of any explicit or tacit recognition. Second, documentality gives weight to the reality of objects by having them do more than merely serve as vessels for the imposition of function. This is especially apparent in Ferraris' description of strong documents, whose recording constitute an act, thereby carrying normative power quite aside from the intentions of the creator. Third, and relatedly, this normative power accorded to recordings has the effects of reintroducing inherent asymmetries of power accorded to recording, into social ontology, as opposed to something like Searle's cooperative model, which, to quote Maurizio, in which, to quote Maurizio actually, society becomes a sort of barbecue weekend in a California suburb. Finally, documentality fruitfully sidesteps the issue of collective intentionality by replacing it with a concrete mechanism for recording. In short, Ferraris' shift to recording reconstructs social ontology by relocating its foundation in inscription, thereby emphasizing the materiality, temporal persistence, and autonomy of the social. Ferraris' system for the institution and maintenance of social reality rests on the constitutive rule social object equals recorded act. This seemingly simple rule exhibits an unprecedented force in that it allows us to reorientate the complex ontological nature and structure of social reality in terms of simpler recordings. Humans are, for Ferraris, at bottom animals endowed with inscriptions, while any social object is conceived of as a recording that can take place in multiple ways. On this view, social reality requires a social act involving at least two people or a machine and a person that is characterized by a recording of some sort. It is worth noting that what is essential here is not the material substrate of the recording as such, but the very possibility of recording and the iterability that it instantiates. In this way, social reality becomes to be grounded in the relation between action and inscription rather than recognition. Ferraris' emphasis on recording is also intended as a critique of postmodern constructivism, especially in the form of the excesses brought about by late Derridianism, its use of ironic scare quotes, the formula of the always already, and the overly excited use of ellipses. To be sure, Ferraris recognizes the importance of Derrida's emphasis on the constitutive yet impersonal force of iteration. Nevertheless, it seems to me that he questions Derrida on two fundamental fronts. In the first instance, he rejects Derrida's obsession with finding the mechanism that could blow up a system that in most cases works. In this respect, the constructive critique has, as Bruno Latour puts it, most definitely run out of steam. Furthermore, he questions Derrida's idealist strong textualism, namely the insistence on treating all reality as fundamentally textually constructed, via the dictum that there is nothing outside the text. Ferraris' rebuttal consists in a weak textualism, which restricts textuality specifically to the social domain. Derrida's original maxim is thus reformulated in documentality into there is nothing social outside the text, thereby excluding the domain of natural and ideal objects from being absorbed into a ubiquitous textual idealism. Nevertheless, in true Derridian style, I suspect that this rejection is never quite as simple as it may seem. In his more recent work, especially in Hysteresis, Ferraris introduces a further development that, it seems to me, may be said to extend but also complicate this earlier position just discussed. While documentality initially appears as a local ontology that grounds the social, the work of Hysteresis extends the aforementioned insight of recording into a general metaphysics. More specifically, Hysteresis, defined as the survival of an effect once its cause has disappeared, comes to define the temporal structure of recording. Within this framework, Hysteresis, qua general constitutive rule of reality, an inscription preserves a trace beyond the original event, thereby enabling the persistence, repetition, and transformation of anything that may be said to endure. Hysteresis thus becomes documentality, generalized into a metaphysical condition for the institution and persistence of anything whatsoever. What is especially worth noting is the fact that Ferraris explicitly links the activity of hysteresis to Derridian difference, in that both notions rest on the dual process of difference and deferral, or what Derrida describes as the becoming time of space and the becoming space of time. In recording, an event is deferred through its inscription, allowing for the possibility of alteration through iteration. The trace preserves and transforms the alleged origin, allowing for the generation of new entities and the persistence of old ones. This connection between the work of Ferraris and Derrida, however, becomes all the more interesting and pertinent when the former asserts that the notion of hysteresis was in fact developed as a result of a generalization of his constitutive rule of social objects. If this generalization holds, it would follow that his speculative metaphysics bears a stronger relation to Derrida than one would assume at face value. On the one hand, and as I have shown, Ferraris effectively amends rather than rejecting tout court Derrida's alleged idealist generalization by localizing it within the realm of social reality, specifically. On the other hand, if it is true that hysteresis generalizes the constitutive rule of social object, as Ferraris himself alleges, it would follow that it would reintroduce a certain Derridian logic at the heart of metaphysics itself. Recording, iteration, alteration, and interruption, qua effects of the activity of hysteresis, come to be seen as universal features of being that extend beyond the social and towards natural processes and technological systems. From the perspective of social ontology, development of hysteresis has two far-reaching consequences. In one sense, it reinforces Ferraris' long-lasting insight that recording is fundamental to the constitution of social reality. In another respect, it also situates this fundamental insight within a broader metaphysical framework that makes the constitutive rule of social objects appear as a local expression of a more general principle. I must emphasize that I neither believe that Ferraris simply repeats Derrida, nor that Derrida preempts Ferraris' thought. For starters, Ferraris develops an explicitly positive metaphysics that Derrida might have never done, or at least not without the usual healthy dose of caveats, ironic scare quotes, always alreadys, ellipsis, elliptic sentences, and puns. Furthermore, hysteresis complicates the weak-strong textualist distinction in fruitful ways by integrating ontology, epistemology, and technology into a powerful, productive, unifying system, a general metaphysics. Evidence of this productive force may be seen in recent works such as Webfare, where the value of recording is mobilized into a digital welfare system that redistributes surplus wealth, in order to satisfy universal human needs and promote collective well-being. What I ultimately want to suggest in drawing this parallel between hysteresis and difference is that the future of new realism might lie in a further exploration of the complex relation between the thought of Ferraris, Derrida, and the many other thinkers who are currently mobilizing the work of both these thinkers towards new forms of realism and materialism. Thank you very much.